Hey friends, welcome back to Guess What? Compliance can be simple. I'm your host, Dr. Natasha Guess, founder of Guess Compliance Consultant LLC, where I work specifically with small and mid-sized healthcare practices to build compliance systems that actually function in real operational environments. Now, on the last episode, we reframed HIPAA as an operational blueprint and established that the function it requires already exists in most healthcare practices. The gap is not in activity, it is in documentation and intentionality. Now, today we're going deeper on documentation and training because these are two of the most consistently undervalued compliance functions in small and mid-sized healthcare practices. And they are undervalued because they are often misunderstood. Now, let me start with documentation. When most people hear documentation, they hear paperwork, they hear administrative burden, and they hear something that takes time away from the real work of running a practice. I want you to hear something different. For a practice manager, a practice supervisor, a practice owner, or a COO, documentation is the operational evidence that your compliance systems are actually functioning. Think about what regulators are looking for. We've discussed this in a few episodes. They're looking for evidence of your oversight, evidence that when risks were identified, they were addressed, evidence that policies are followed in practice, not just written on paper, and evidence that training happened and produced actual results. They're also looking at evidence that when something went wrong, the practice or organization responded with a structured process. All of that evidence lives in your documentation. And if the documentation does not exist, the evidence does not exist either. Even if everything actually happened exactly the way it was supposed to, if you do not have that evidence in your documentation, a regulator will not see it as being something that they can actually test and verify. And this is one of the most frustrating realities of healthcare compliance. An organization can be doing everything right and still struggle during a regulatory review because the evidence of what they were doing was never captured in a way that demonstrates a pattern. So, what does compliance ready documentation actually look like? I can tell you that. It has 4 characteristics. 1, clear ownership. Every compliance sensitive function in your organization or practice needs a name attached to it. Who is responsible for review and vendor agreements? Who owns the workforce training schedule? Who is notified when a potential incident occurs? If the answer to any of those questions is everyone, or it depends, then the answer is effectively no one. Named ownership with documented accountability is what makes compliance functions executable in lean teams. The next is consistency. Documentation must reflect a pattern of oversight over time. If you have a single training record, that does not demonstrate a training program. A vendor agreement reviewed once does not demonstrate ongoing vendor management. Again, regulators are looking for patterns. Documentation that shows the same functions being executed consistently over months and years is what creates that pattern. The next thing is operational alignment. This simply means that documentation must reflect what actually happens in the practice or organization, not what was intended when the policy was written, not what the template assumed when it was downloaded, what actually happens in the workflow today. When documentation and actual practice diverge, the documentation becomes a liability rather than a protection for the practice. Another thing that we're looking at is evidence of review. Documents that are never reviewed and updated are not evidence of compliance. They're evidence of inactivity. Policies, vendor agreements, training materials, and risk assessments all need documented review histories that show that your organization or practice is actively maintaining its compliance framework. Now let's talk about training. Training is what determines whether your staff can actually execute your compliance systems. You can have the best policies in the state, and if your staff do not know what those policies require of them in their specific role, those policies will not protect your organization or practice when something goes wrong. The most common training mistake that I've seen in small and mid-sized healthcare practices is relying on generic HIPAA training. And they're using this generic HIPAA awareness training as the primary compliance education for all staff. We spoke about this in the previous episode. Generic annual training produces compliance signatures. That is all it produces. Role-based training produces behavior. And if your front desk person, if their compliance responsibilities are different from your billing specialist compliance responsibilities, which are different from your clinical staff members' responsibilities, which are also different from an operations manager's responsibilities. Each one of those roles will have specific exposure points. There will be specific workflows and specific compliance decisions built into their daily work. Training that connects to those specifics, that walks staff through the scenarios they actually encounter, that tells them what to do when something unexpected happens in their particular function, is training that changes behavior. And behavioral change is the only thing that actually reduces compliance risk. Now, there's also two additional elements that make training effective. Documentation of training must go beyond completion records. It must also capture what was covered, who received it, when it was received, and how competency was assessed. Not just a checkbox that a module was completed, a record that actually demonstrates the organization invested in building the specific knowledge its team needed. And training must be updated when workflows change, not just annually. When a new system is implemented, when a new vendor relationship is established, when a staff member's role is changed significantly, each of those changes introduces new compliance responsibilities. And if training does not reflect those changes, the gap between what staff were trained to do and what they are actually being asked to do becomes a compliance risk for your practice. Now, here's what I want you to take away from this episode. Documentation is evidence. Training is capability. Both require ownership, consistency, and alignment with how the practice actually works. And in lean teams, where one person often wears multiple hats, the key is not building a comprehensive compliance infrastructure from scratch. It is connecting the compliance functions that already exist to the documentation and training systems that make them defensible. Now, if you want to start closing some of those gaps today, I have 2 resources in the show notes. My book, The Compliance Trap, How Not to Get Fined, Sued, or Shut Down. It's available now on Kindle, and it was written specifically for practice owners navigating exactly what we discussed today. And I also have the Guesswork Ends Here HIPAA Compliance Template Kit. That gives you the templates and a 30-day roadmap to start building a defensible compliance foundation right now. Both links will be in the show notes. Now, in next week's episode, we're going to talk about something that trips up organizations of every size. Compliance is not a project, it is a living system. And understanding what that means in practice changes how you build for it. So I'm very excited for that episode. I'm Dr. Natasha Guess. Thank you for listening to Guess What? Compliance Can Be Simple. You can also schedule a free compliance strategy call using the link in the show notes. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, keep it simple, stay compliant, and protect your patients.